My name is Renata Hollis. I'm 34 years old, and the last time I stood in my father's study, I was being walked out of it by two paramedics while my mother stood on the porch and cried for the neighbors. I wasn't combative. I wasn't screaming. I was holding a hanging folder labeled Insurance, 2019, and I was completely calm, and none of that mattered because my mother had already made the call and the story was already written. The story was that her daughter had been unraveling since her father died. The story was that she'd tried everything. The story was that this was an act of love. I rode in the back of that ambulance and I didn't say a word. I watched the ceiling. I counted the rivets in the panel above me. There were 14. And I thought about the 6 digits I had carried in my head for over a year, and I thought, she has no idea. She has absolutely no idea. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let me take you back to the beginning, because none of this makes sense without understanding the house I grew up in. Not the building, the atmosphere. Before I do, if you're already feeling something watching this, if something in the first 30 seconds of this story already made your chest tighten in a way you recognize, I need you to hit that like button right now, subscribe so you don't miss a single part of this, and share this with someone who needs to hear it. This story is for the people who were always told they were too sensitive, too suspicious, too much. I see you. Now let me keep going. My father, Gerald, was an estate attorney. Quiet man, precise. The kind of person who noticed things but rarely commented on them, which I used to think was wisdom, and later understood was something closer to exhaustion. My mother, Darlene, was the one who ran the house. And I mean, ran it the way a property manager runs a building. Efficiently, with clear rules about who had access to what. We lived in Asheville, North Carolina, in a house that was large enough that you could avoid people you didn't want to see, which was a feature, not a flaw. There were 4 of us, my mother, my father, my brother Colt, and me. Colt is 5 years younger than me, and he was always easier. That's the word my mother used. Colt is just easier. She said it the way you'd compliment a door for not squeaking. What she meant was that Colt didn't ask questions. He didn't sit in the hallway outside their bedroom door when voices got sharp. He didn't notice when the atmosphere of a room changed the moment she walked in. He just lived in the house the way you live in weather, without analyzing it. And I think she loved him better for it. Not because she was a monster, because his ease made her feel safe in a way I never did. I was 11 when I found my father alone in his study, crying. He was sitting at his desk with the lamp on, and his hands flat on the surface like he was trying to hold it down. I sat next to him without asking. He looked at me after a long moment and said, "You have a gift for noticing things other people miss, Renata." Then he changed the subject and never mentioned it again. I spent the next 20 years trying to understand what he had been crying about, and the next 20 years trying to decide whether being a noticer was something to be proud of or something to apologize for. In my family, it was mostly the latter. Darlene did not pay for my college. She had the money. She chose not to. She told me, and I want to be precise about her exact words because she was always precise. She told me that financial independence builds character. What she meant was that financial dependence builds obedience, and since I showed no natural talent for obedience, she was cutting off the mechanism. Colt's tuition was paid in full. I found out about that during Thanksgiving of my junior year, and I sat with it through the entire meal without saying anything. And afterward, I drove home to my apartment and reorganized my entire bookshelf at midnight, because that is what I do when I am trying to convert chaos into something I can manage. I graduated from UNC Asheville with a degree in archival studies. I paid for it with loans, work study, and a part-time job at the university library where I shelved books from 6 to 10 a.m., 3 days a week before my first class. I am not telling you this for sympathy. I'm telling you because you need to understand that by the time any of this happened, I had been building my own life from scratch for over a decade, and I was good at it, quiet and precise and good at it, and nobody in my family had once said so. The first major betrayal, and I'm calling it that now because I've had enough therapy to name things correctly, came when I got promoted. I was 28, and I had just become the records and compliance specialist for a regional healthcare network. It was a real job, a real salary, something I had worked for methodically and earned completely. I called my mother. She said, "Oh, that's nice, honey. Are you coming home for Easter?" That was the entire conversation. I sat in my car afterward for 11 minutes, counted the time on my phone, 11 minutes before I could make myself drive. Paige called me that night. Paige Murtaugh. She'd been my closest friend since our second year of college, a social worker, the kind of person who sees through performance the way light goes through water. She said, "Tell me everything." And I did. And she said, at the end of it, with no preamble, "Renata, the people who should be celebrating you the loudest are the quietest. That's not an accident. That's information." I didn't know then how right she was, or how much I was going to need that sentence later. The thing about Paige is that she never introduced herself to my family as my friend. She showed up as herself, completely and without apology, and my family responded the way they always responded to people they couldn't categorize, with a particular brand of polite cold. My mother called her outspoken. My brother looked at her like she was a weather pattern he hadn't planned for. My father shook her hand and held it a second longer than necessary, and nodded once, slowly, like he was confirming something he'd already suspected. That nod. I thought about it for years. And then my father got sick. Not dramatically, quietly, the way he did everything. A cardiac event at 71 that he did not fully recover from, and then 14 months of gradual diminishing, and then he was gone. He died on a Tuesday, which felt wrong for reasons I couldn't articulate. He was a Tuesday kind of person in the best sense, reliable, steady, there. He deserved a longer week. 2 weeks before he died, he called me. Not my mother's phone, his cell, which he barely used. He said he wanted me to know that he had made sure I was taken care of, that there was a will, a real one, prepared by his own estate attorney. Not the family lawyer my mother used for everything, but his own man, someone independent. He said the document was in the safe in his study. And then he told me the combination. I was sitting in a parking garage downtown when he said it. I wrote it on a receipt from the coffee shop on the second floor. I memorized it. I read it back to him once to confirm it. Then we talked for 12 more minutes about nothing important. The weather in Asheville, whether I'd seen a particular documentary he liked, and at the end he said, "I love you, Renata. You were always the one who noticed things." I threw the receipt away. I didn't need it anymore. What I didn't know yet, what I wouldn't understand until much later, was that my father had made that call because he already knew something was wrong. He already knew what was coming, and he had handed me the only key that mattered before he ran out of time to explain why. The estate settlement began 3 weeks after the funeral. I want you to understand what that phrase actually means, estate settlement, because it sounds administrative. It sounds like paperwork and signatures and things being distributed in an orderly way according to a document that says what a person wanted done with their life's work after they were gone. That is what it is supposed to mean. What it meant in practice in my family was that my mother called a meeting at the house and sat at the dining room table with the family attorney, a man named Garrett Sims, who had handled everything Darlene-related for 20 years, and produced a will. I had never seen this document, not once. It was 12 pages, properly bound, notarized, signed. It left the entirety of my father's estate, the house, the 3 investment accounts, the private family trust he had built over 30 years of careful, quiet work, in a discretionary trust managed solely by Darlene. Distributions to Colt and me were at her sole and absolute determination. No timeline, no minimums, no oversight. I read it twice at the table while Garrett Sims watched me with the particular expression of a man who was being paid to look neutral. "This isn't what he told me," I said. My mother folded her hands. "Gerald was not well in his final months, Renata. His thinking wasn't always—" "He called me 2 weeks before he died. He was completely clear." "Grief does things to memory," she said, not unkindly. That was the thing about Darlene. She was never unkind in a way you could point to. She was smooth, managed. "Garrett has been over everything thoroughly. This is the document. I looked at the signature. It looked like my father's signature. I am not a handwriting expert. I am a records and compliance specialist, which means I know what a properly executed document looks like on the surface, and I know that the surface is not always the whole story. I called Paige from the driveway before I even started my car. She produced a will, I said. It gives her everything. There was a pause. Is it his signature? It looks like it. Another pause. Renata, document everything. Every communication, every date, every conversation. Start tonight. I did. I went home and I opened a new folder on my laptop, labeled with the date, the way I label everything, and I started typing. Every conversation I could remember, every date. The phone call with my father 2 weeks before he died. The combination he gave me. The document I had seen at the table. The exact words my mother had used. I typed for 3 hours and then I made myself stop and sleep because I knew I was going to need to be functional. And then the months started passing. I want you to understand something about the kind of injustice that happens slowly. It doesn't feel like an emergency. It feels like water. Constant, low level, reshaping everything it touches without making any sudden dramatic moves. I sent emails to Garrett Sims about the estate timeline. I received polite, delaying responses. I asked for documentation of the trust structure. I was told it was being finalized. I asked when distributions would begin. I was told these things took time. I was always told these things took time. I have to stop here for a second, because I think about this part of the story a lot. The part where I kept asking reasonable questions through reasonable channels and kept being managed, smoothly, by people who were being paid to manage me. And I wonder how many of you know exactly what that feels like. Not the dramatic betrayal, not the moment of crisis, but the slow, procedural gaslighting of being told everything is fine, everything is proceeding, just be patient, while you can feel in your bones that something is wrong and you have absolutely no way to prove it yet. Has anyone in your life ever used the system, the process, the procedure, the paperwork, as a weapon against you? Used the language of patience and professionalism to keep you from getting to what you were owed? I want to know. Drop it in the comments because I think this is more common than people admit, and I read every single one. Because here is what was actually happening while I was being told to be patient. Paige found out first. She has a colleague at a nonprofit who moves in the same social circles as my mother's church friends, and information travels in those circles the way water travels. It finds the cracks. What Paige heard was that my mother had been telling people I was struggling, that the grief had hit me harder than anyone had anticipated, that she was worried about my stability. Paige called me on a Thursday evening. I remember because I was eating dinner standing at my kitchen counter, which is what I do when I'm too distracted to sit down. She's been talking, Paige said. About what? About you. To people from her church. To the Hendersons. You know who the Hendersons are, right? The couple your dad used to golf with? She told Carol Henderson that you had been making accusations about the estate, and that it was coming from a place of grief-induced paranoia. I put down my fork. Paranoia, I said. That was the word. I stood there in my kitchen with the refrigerator humming, and I thought about how precisely my mother had chosen that word. Not confusion, not anger, paranoia. The word that doesn't just disagree with what you're saying, it relocates the problem from the situation to your mind. I want to tell you about the life I had built by this point, because I need you to see it clearly. I had a one-bedroom apartment on the east side of Asheville, second floor, with windows that faced a row of old oak trees. I had a job I was genuinely good at, managing documentation and compliance for 3 hospital campuses, which meant that every day I was the person people called when something needed to be found, verified, or proven. I had Paige. I had a routine I had built from nothing, that worked, that was mine. It was not a dramatic life. It was a quiet, functional, self-made life. And I want you to understand that I was not sitting around waiting to be rescued or validated. I was working. I was building. I was paying off loans and keeping my car maintained and making dinner for myself most nights, and calling Paige on Thursdays. There was one night, I want to be honest about this, where I almost went back. Not to the house, to the version of things where I accept the managed timeline, the smooth delays, the gracious patience my mother was modeling for everyone around her. It was a Sunday in November, about 8 months after my father died, and it was raining, and I was tired in the particular way you get tired when you've been holding tension for a long time without resolution. I picked up my phone and I opened my mother's contact and I sat there for a long time. And then I thought about my father in his study, his hands flat on the desk. You have a gift for noticing things other people miss. And I thought, I notice this. I know what I know. And I put my phone down. 3 months into what should have been a straightforward estate process, I submitted a formal written request, through Garrett Sims, for a copy of the trust instrument and a full accounting of all estate assets. The response came back in 12 days. It was 2 paragraphs. It told me the trust was still being finalized and that distributions would commence at the trustee's discretion. The trustee was my mother. I had a notary I trusted review the signature on the will. She told me it appeared valid. She was not a forensic document examiner. She was a notary. There is a difference. But at that point, I didn't have the resources for a forensic examiner, and I didn't yet have an attorney, and I was still operating inside the channels I had been given, which is what you do when you are a reasonable person who is not yet ready to accept that the channels themselves are compromised. And then something arrived. It came on a Tuesday, 14 months after my father died, which means it came on the kind of day he deserved. I had been at work. I came home and found a manila envelope in my mailbox with a return address I didn't immediately recognize, a law firm in Charlotte I had never heard of. Not Garrett Sims, not anyone connected to my mother. I held it in the stairwell of my building for a long moment. I turned it over. My name was typed on the label, not handwritten, typed, and below it, in smaller text, the words Re. Estate of Gerald Hollis. I did not open it in the stairwell. I carried it upstairs. I put it on my kitchen table. I made a cup of coffee I didn't drink. I sat down. I opened it. Inside was a letter, 2 pages, and attached to the letter was a document I had never seen before, a copy of a will. Not the will Garrett Sims had presented, a different one, an earlier one, the one my father had apparently had prepared 14 months before his death by his own private estate attorney, a man named Douglas Parr, practicing out of Charlotte, who had been holding a copy this entire time and had just learned, through a colleague, that the probate process in Asheville had concluded without anyone ever contacting him. My hands were shaking by the 3rd paragraph. I called Paige. She answered on the 2nd ring. "Come over," I said. "I'm already getting my keys," she said. I read the letter 4 times before Paige arrived. Not because I didn't understand it the first time, because I needed to make sure I wasn't constructing something, filling in gaps with what I wanted to be true instead of what was actually there. This is what my mother's narrative about me had done, even to me. Even knowing it was a narrative, even being the person who had built the counterfile, I still sat at my kitchen table and read a document 4 times to confirm that I was reading it correctly and not inventing it. That is what sustained gaslighting does. It doesn't just change how other people see you. It gets into the space between you and your own perception, and it makes you check yourself twice, 3 times, 4 times, before you'll trust what you see. Paige knocked twice and let herself in. I had given her a key 2 years ago for reasons that had nothing to do with this, and everything to do with who she is. She sat down across from me, looked at my face, looked at the papers on the table, and didn't say anything. She just poured herself the coffee I hadn't drunk, topped off my mug, and waited. "He had his own attorney," I said, "in Charlotte, a man named Douglas Parr. Dad went to see him 14 months before he died, so about 2 months after his first cardiac episode, and had a new will prepared. Parr kept a copy. He just found out that the probate in Asheville concluded without anyone contacting him." Paige set down her mug. "Meaning Garrett Sims filed a different will?" "Meaning Garrett Sims filed a different will." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What does the real one say?" I looked down at the document. The house goes to my mother for her lifetime. That part is the same, but the investment account split equally between me and Colt after a living allowance to her. And the private trust, Dad's trust, is administered by an independent trustee named in the document. Not her. Not her, Paige repeated. Not her. We sat with that for a moment. Outside, the oak trees were moving in the wind. I watched them through the window because I needed something to look at that wasn't the paper in my hands. Renata, Paige said carefully, the trust, do you know how much is in it? Not exactly, but based on what Dad told me over the years, the contributions he made, the growth, it should be close to $800,000, she exhaled slowly. And she's been the sole administrator for 14 months. Yes. Neither of us said the obvious thing. We didn't need to. The obvious thing sat at the table with us and had its own coffee. What happened next is the part of the story I have to be precise about, because precision is what saved me. I called Paige the next morning. She had gone home at midnight after we had spent 3 hours going through everything, and I asked her if she still had the name of that probate attorney. Warren Eckley. She had looked him up the day I was committed, which tells you everything about Paige. She had been 3 steps ahead of the crisis the entire time, waiting for me to catch up. I met Warren in his office 4 days later. It was a Tuesday again. I was starting to feel superstitious about Tuesdays. His office was small and overloaded with files, stacked on the shelves, stacked on the floor, a particular kind of organized chaos that I understood immediately because I live a version of it. He had a gray beard and reading glasses he kept taking off and putting back on, and the energy of someone who had been angry about something specific for a very long time and had learned to aim it precisely. He read the letter from Douglas Parr. He read the copy of the original will. He looked at the documentation I had brought, 11 days of handwritten notes from my time at Ridgeview, the discharge paperwork, the timeline of every stalled communication with Garrett Sims, the photographs I had taken of the fraudulent will before it was filed. He looked up at me over his glasses. You kept all of this. I work in records and compliance, I said. I keep everything. The original will, he said. Where is it? In a safe in my father's study, in my mother's house. Do you have access to the combination? Yes. Does she know that? No. He took his glasses off, set them on the desk, looked at me directly for the first time in the conversation with something that wasn't quite surprise and wasn't quite admiration, something more like recognition, like he was seeing the shape of a case he knew how to build. Here's what I want to do, he said. He explained the emergency petition, a filing with the probate court to compel access to the property for the purpose of retrieving original estate documents. Given the documentation of the involuntary commitment and its timing, initiated within 6 minutes of me entering the study, extended twice, resolved with no psychiatric diagnosis, he had a compelling argument for obstruction. He explained it methodically, in sequence, the way I organize things, and I found myself breathing more steadily with each step because he was translating what I knew into something a court could see. I went home that night and I did not reorganize anything. I sat on my couch and I was still. The night before the petition was granted, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed and I thought about my father in his study, crying. I thought about the 14 rivets in the ceiling of the ambulance. I thought about 6 digits I had carried in my head for over a year, quiet and intact, through every single thing that had happened. There is something I want to say about that, about the strange comfort of having a piece of knowledge that no one could reach. My mother could control the narrative. She could call 911. She could produce documents. She could tell her church friends about my instability over coffee after Sunday service. She could not get inside my memory. She had underestimated the one thing about me that had always been true. I notice things, and I keep them. The morning the court order came through, Paige drove me. She didn't ask if I wanted company. She showed up at 8 a.m. with 2 coffees and her canvas tote covered in her kids' sticker designs, and she drove, and we didn't talk much. I watched Asheville move past the window, the streets I grew up driving, the bakery on Lexington where my father used to stop on Saturday mornings, the turn onto the long residential road that leads to the house. I had made this drive hundreds of times. It had never felt like this. Warren met us at the property with a court officer and a locksmith. My mother was already there. She was required to be present per the order. She was standing in the front doorway in her pearl gray wrap dress, her hands folded in front of her face arranged into something that looked like concern. Her attorney, a man in an expensive suit who carried himself with the confidence of someone who had been told the petition wouldn't be granted, stood slightly behind her. I got out of Paige's car and I walked toward the house, and I did not look at my mother's face. I looked at the door. The front door I had walked through thousands of times. It was painted dark green. My father had chosen that color. He had held up 7 paint samples against the frame and asked my opinion when I was 9 years old, and I had pointed at the darkest one and he had said, "That one, yes." We went inside. I walked through the house without stopping. Through the entry, past the dining room where we had sat around that table 14 months ago, down the hallway with the photographs my mother had arranged by size rather than by memory. There is something so precisely her about that. And into my father's study. This is the moment. This is the one I need you to understand completely. I had not been in this room since the night I was taken out of it. The lamp was off. The filing cabinet in the corner was closed. His desk was clear. Someone had cleared it, which felt wrong in a way I couldn't fully name, because he always had things on his desk. Always. The room smelled faintly of him still, or maybe I was constructing that, but I don't think I was. I think some people leave something in the rooms they lived in, and my father was one of them. The bookshelf panel, behind the third section from the left. I had known about this safe since I was 14, and had never been given the combination until 2 weeks before he died. I reached for the panel. It opened on a small hinge. The safe was gray, fireproof, the size of a shoebox. I entered the 6 digits. The mechanism released. And I want to pause here for just a second. Not because I want to be dramatic, but because this moment, standing in my father's study with that safe open in front of me, and my mother standing in the doorway behind me, this is the moment I understood what he had done. He hadn't just left me a will, he had left me a way in. He had handed me the key before he ran out of time to explain why, and he had trusted me to carry it. And I had. And here I was. If that hits you the way it hit me, if you feel what I felt standing there, hit that like button. Subscribe if you haven't. I need you here for what comes next. Inside the safe, the original will, folded once, in a plain white envelope with my father's handwriting on the outside. And beneath it, a smaller envelope, sealed, with my name on it, just Renata. Warren was beside me. He photographed the will, bagged it carefully, noted the contents on the record in front of the court officer. I held the smaller envelope and did not open it. My mother said from the doorway in a voice I had heard my entire life, the voice she used when she was performing composure. "Renata, I think we should discuss this as a family before—" I turned around. I looked at her. Not with anger, I want to be clear about that. I looked at her the way you look at something you have been trying to see clearly for a very long time and have finally stopped blinking for. "Warren," I said, "please continue." Her attorney asked, in a voice that had lost its earlier confidence, whether they might discuss the matter before anything was filed. Warren said that the matter had already been filed, and then I looked at my mother one more time, really looked at her, in her gray dress with her hands still folded, her face doing the thing it always did, performing the version of herself she needed the room to believe, and for one brief, devastating second, I saw her. Not the antagonist of my story, just a woman who had grown up with nothing, married a man who gave her everything, and couldn't figure out how to survive losing him without holding on so hard she broke things. She was 61 years old and she was terrified, and she had done something unforgivable from a place of pure fear, and I understood it. And it cost me something to understand it. I didn't say any of that. I picked up my tote bag. I walked out of the study, down the hallway, past the photographs arranged by size, through the front door painted the color I had chosen when I was 9 years old. I didn't make a speech. I didn't need one. The document Warren was holding said everything that needed to be said. I sat in Paige's car for a long time before I told her to drive. Not 11 minutes this time. I didn't count. I just sat there with my tote bag on my lap, and the small envelope with my name on it in my hands, and I watched the front door of the house, that dark green door, until I felt something shift. Not release, not relief, something quieter than that. The particular stillness of a thing that has been in motion for a very long time coming, finally, to rest. "Okay," I said. Paige started the car. She didn't ask me about the envelope. She drove. We went past the bakery on Lexington, and she pulled into the parking lot without asking, and came back 3 minutes later with 2 croissants in a paper bag, and handed me mine without a word. And I ate it in the passenger seat, watching the street, and that was the kindest thing anyone had done for me in as long as I could remember. I read my father's letter that night, alone, at my kitchen table with the lamp on. I had been imagining it all day, constructing versions of it in my head, preparing myself for something I couldn't fully anticipate. But the thing about my father was that he wrote the way he talked, quietly, precisely, without performance. No grand declarations, no dramatic confessions, just Gerald, sitting somewhere, writing to his daughter the things he hadn't said out loud while he had the chance. He wrote that he knew the dynamic between Darlene and me had never been simple. He wrote that he had not known how to fix it, and was sorry he hadn't tried harder. He wrote that he had seen what she was doing, not this, not the will. He didn't know about this specifically, but the pattern of it. The way she managed me, the way she used patience and procedure, and the language of concern to keep me at a distance she controlled. He had seen it and said nothing, and he was sorry. He wrote that he had spent a long time mistaking my ability to notice things for difficulty, when I was young, and that he had not made that mistake later. He wrote that the phone call, the safe code, the attorney in Charlotte, none of it was an accident. He had been trying to make sure that whatever happened, I had a way through. He wrote, "I am proud of you in a way I did not say enough, and I am sorry for the silence, and I love you, and I believe you will be fine." I folded the letter back into its envelope. I labeled the envelope. Dad, keep. I placed it in the folder with his name on it, the one I had started the night of the funeral, and I closed the folder and put it in the drawer and sat there for a while with my hands flat on the table. He had known. Before any of it escalated, before the ambulance and the facility and the petition and Warren and all of it, he had known what she was capable of, and he had done something about it with everything he had left. He had handed me the key and trusted me to find the door. The probate court's findings came in stages over the following months, and I want to tell you what that process looked like, because I think people imagine legal vindication as a single dramatic moment, a ruling, a bang of the gavel, a clear before and after. It is not that. It is a series of smaller moments, each one requiring documentation and patience, and the particular stamina of someone who is willing to keep showing up. Douglas Parr, the attorney in Charlotte, flew to Asheville to give his testimony. He was 72, semi-retired, with the bearing of someone who had been waiting to set a record straight and was relieved to finally have the opportunity. He confirmed the date of the will's execution, the conditions under which it was prepared, and the fact that he had received no communication from Garrett Sims or anyone connected to the estate at any point during the probate process. Garrett Sims's attorney suggested this was an administrative oversight. Warren looked at him across the room with the expression of a man who had been doing this for 30 years and had a very low tolerance for the phrase, administrative oversight. Colt's affidavit was entered into the record. He had driven to Warren's office on his own, unannounced, on a Monday morning, and sat down and given a full statement about the document his mother had asked him to sign, the language she had used, and what he had been told about the will. He was not a hero in this story. I want to be honest about that. He had known for months and done nothing, and the thing that finally moved him was not conscience alone, but the investment account statements that showed $340,000 drawn from the trust in 14 months. He did the right thing in the end, and he did it for complicated reasons, which is how most right things get done. The forensic document examiner Warren retained concluded that the signature on the probated will showed indicators inconsistent with Gerald Hollis's authentic signature samples taken from legal documents spanning 30 years of practice. Inconsistent. That is the word the report used. Precise, qualified, Exactly the kind of language that holds up in court. Garrett Sims surrendered his law license as part of the civil resolution. My mother's attorney negotiated an agreement. Full restoration of the drawn funds, all legal costs covered, permanent removal from the estate's administration. No criminal charges were filed, which is a decision I did not make and cannot fully explain except to say that Warren advised me on the options, and I chose the one that ended it cleanly. I did not want to sit across from my mother in a criminal courtroom. I had already looked at her as clearly as I needed to. The estate was restructured according to my father's original will. The independent trustee he had named took over administration. The investment accounts were divided. The living allowance to my mother was established. The house remained hers for her lifetime. Everything he had wanted, executed the way he had intended, 14 months late but intact. I did not feel victorious. I want to be clear about that because I think it's important. I felt tired in the specific way of someone who has been right about something painful for a very long time and has finally been told so officially. There is no celebration in that. There is only the quiet settling of a weight you had started to believe you would carry forever. My mother called me once, about 6 weeks after the resolution. I let it go to voicemail. She left a message that was 3 minutes and 40 seconds long. I know the exact length because I checked before deciding whether to listen to it. I didn't listen to it. I saved it to a folder on my phone, labeled, dated, and I have not opened it since. I don't know if I ever will. That is not bitterness. That is just where I am. I heard about her through the Asheville network, the way you hear about everything in a town that size. Through Paige, through a colleague, through the woman at the dry cleaner who has known our family for 20 years. My mother stopped going to the church, sold her membership at the country club. The Hendersons, Carol and her husband, the couple she had told about my paranoia, reportedly stopped returning her calls. Not because anyone made a campaign of it, just because in a small community, when the story corrects itself, the social geometry shifts on its own. She didn't need me to do anything to her. She had done it herself. I did not celebrate that either. About 2 months after everything concluded, Colt called me on a Sunday afternoon. I was in my apartment, reorganizing my filing system, not from anxiety this time, just because it genuinely needed it. And I looked at his name on the screen and I answered. He didn't apologize immediately, which I actually respected. He said, "I've been trying to figure out what to say to you for weeks and everything sounds wrong." "Most things do," I said. There was a long pause. "I signed that statement," he said. "I knew what it meant and I signed it anyway. And I've been trying to tell myself it was more complicated than that, and it wasn't. It was exactly that simple and I did it anyway." I sat down on my couch. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry, Renata." "I know that too." We talked for 40 minutes. Not about the estate, not about our mother, not about any of it specifically. Just talked, the way we used to talk when we were kids before the house taught us that talking openly was a liability. It was not repaired. You do not repair something like this in a phone call on a Sunday. But the line was open. That was something real. I wrote one letter. Not to my mother. I had nothing left to say to Darlene that Warren hadn't already said more precisely in a probate court. I wrote it to Douglas Parr in Charlotte, the attorney who had kept my father's real will in a filing cabinet and driven to Asheville at 72 to testify about it. I thanked him. I told him what the letter from my father had said. I told him that my father had been a precise, quiet man who had found a precise, quiet way to protect his daughter, and that he had chosen the right person to help him do it. Douglas Parr wrote back within a week. He said, "Gerald told me when we prepared the document that his daughter was the one who noticed things. He said I'd know I had the right person when she walked in and already understood half of what I was about to explain. He was right. You did." I read that letter at my kitchen table with the lamp on, the same way I read everything that matters, and Paige was there. She had come over for no particular occasion, which is the occasion she comes over for most often. And I read it to her out loud, and when I finished she just said, "He saw you, Renata. He saw you the whole time." I am 34 years old. I live in a one-bedroom apartment in Asheville with windows that face a row of old oak trees, And in the mornings, I make coffee and watch the light come through the branches. And I think about my father the way you think about someone you are slowly learning to remember without grief. Not because the grief is gone, but because it has made room for something else. Gratitude, maybe. The complicated kind. The kind that holds both the loss and the love at the same time without needing to resolve the tension between them. I still organize things. I still label folders and make lists and convert chaos into sequence when the world feels like too much. I have stopped apologizing for it. It is the thing that saved me. Not just in the practical sense of building the documentation that Warren needed, but in the deeper sense of being the kind of person who keeps things, who holds on to what matters, who trusts her own memory, even when someone is standing in front of her telling her it can't be trusted. My father told me I had a gift for noticing things. He was right. And the person who tried to use that against me, who had me committed because I was getting too close to something she needed to hide, she was right too, in her way. I do notice things. I noticed the will. I noticed the discrepancy. I noticed the 6 digits he gave me over the phone on a Tuesday afternoon in a parking garage, and I held them in my memory for 14 months through everything that happened, and I walked into that study, and I opened that safe. She just didn't know I was keeping them. Before you go, I want to ask you something, and I mean this genuinely, not as a closing line, as an actual question I want you to sit with. Has someone ever quietly protected you in a way you only understood much later? A parent, a teacher, a friend? Someone who handed you something before you knew you'd need it? Leave it in the comments. I read every single one, and I think about the answers for longer than you'd expect. If this story stayed with you, if something in it felt true to something you've lived or witnessed, hit that like button, subscribe so you're here for the next story, and share it with someone who needs to be reminded that being the person who notices things is never something to apologize for. My name is Renata Hollis. I'm 34 years old, and I finally know what it feels like to be exactly where I'm supposed to be.